When we talk future of work, education is oftentimes the thing that we jump to right after workforce. And it's important for us to explore how are schools doing? Not just K through 12, but higher ed. So in this next panel, we're going to talk about how can schools move future of work trends in a direction that empowers, challenges, and prepares all students. I'm excited to be leading this next panel, and I'm going to be joined by some rock stars in this session. First, Chisa Egbelu. Chisa is the CEO and chairman of PeduL, a tech startup that's enabling corporations to recruit demographically specific talent through the power of scholarships. Contributing writer at Inc. magazine, where he documents his rise and falls in tech as a young black entrepreneur. We're also joined by Steve Sitek. Steve's the head of learning for the Novartis Learning Institute for Novartis, heading up learning, education, communication, ethics, and compliance. Also is the director of talent management, organization development, and workforce planning. Also an adjunct professor in the Rutgers Business School. Welcome, Steve. I'm also excited to be joined by Shelle Santana. Shelle is an assistant professor of business administration at Harvard University. She's held a variety of senior marketing roles at American Express, and ultimately was the head of U.S. corporate card marketing and global product strategy. It's been featured in Forbes. So I'm excited for this next panel that's going to be exploring education, how it's doing, and what type of impact it's making from the perspective of not just educators, but also C-level executives. Let's kick off this next panel talking education.
I'm very excited about this next panel covering a very timely perspective on the future of work, which is education. And the focus on this panel is very singular around what's the role of schools in the process of future of work? How are we doing directionally? And we're going to explore maybe some of the challenges that some of the folks here on the panel see. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Steve Sitek, who in his current role is the head of learning at Novartis. Shelle Santana, the associate professor at Harvard University. Some of you have heard of Harvard. And Chisa Egbelu, LSU. We could probably sneak an S in there. CEO of tech startup PeduL. And with that, we're gonna go around and let everybody say a quick word to introduce themselves. Shelle, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I'm really excited to be here because I do think that education now has to play an even larger role. It's already played a huge role in terms of people's personal trajectory and sort of how you move from one stage of life to another, one sort of level socioeconomically to another. And I think it plays an even bigger role now in this particular context. So having been at Harvard Business School for several years, prior to that, getting my PhD at NYU, going to undergrad at Cornell, having been at business school at Duke. I've spent a lot of time in school and seeing it from both sides of that desk, I think is really helpful for me. So I'm excited to be here.
Great. And I'm excited to have you, Steve, with us, given the work that you've done at Novartis. I mean, it goes with just a little bit of research on anybody that's not familiar. You've done the amount of work that Novartis as a global organization does around learning is tremendous. So welcome.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to be here as well. Steve Sitek, I'm the head of the Novartis Learning Institute for the US. And yeah, we've done a lot of great work here on the future of learning and the future of work. And we've gotten some great insights. And yes, Shelle, I agree with you. It's especially as people work through career transitions, we know and we do believe that people really there needs to be a network of support, of seamless way to support people as they work through their career transitions, and learning is a big part of that. And just excited to have this conversation.
Great. And Chisa, with PeduL, you're doing some really cool stuff around this perspective of access would be the way I define it. Am I doing it justice?
Absolutely. And just to give everyone a quick background on what PeduL is, for students, PeduL is a common application for scholarships. One application, hundreds of scholarships at one time. And on the other side of that, it's a scholarship builder for individuals, organizations, and corporations. And obviously for corporations right now, it's incredibly relevant because the way that they use us is obviously a company cannot go onto a job posting platform and say they're looking to hire a Black engineer or a Latino data scientist. But what they can do on our platform is put up a scholarship for a Latino data scientist in their second year of graduate school, or a Black developer in their junior year of undergrad. And we're able to aggregate an application pool and turn that into a candidate pipeline. And much like the learning, a candidate pipeline that they can allocate things like training modules and coaching development tools to like One Huddle, to truly develop the skill sets to meet that company's strategic needs. So it's great to be, of course, relevant, but of course, you hate what it took in order to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Shelle, I'd love to start with you because I think it's important to lead off with the definition, because this, the term future of work is sometimes it gets thrown around, and it's been thrown around a lot. How would you define it?
So for me, the future of work is, what is this holistic 360-degree view of what types of skills do people need? Where and how do they actually do that activity? Who's the consumer or the end user of that activity? And then what's all the supporting infrastructure around that in terms of education, in terms of technology, in terms of resources, in terms of telecommuting, in terms of lifestyle, all sorts of things where we talk about 20 years ago, where work was very narrowly defined in terms of you go to an office, you sit at a desk, you have a monitor, and you do this task from 9 to 5. I think that the world and people's lives have changed in such a way that the future of work is much more flexible and dynamic and involves a lot of different activities that people need to be able to do in lots of different ways.
Steve, based off of what Shelle's talking about specifically around future of work, focusing on identifying the skills that people need, you, again, Novartis has done a tremendous job with so many different applications and resources to try to upskill, reskill workers. How do you look at the skill development side of the future of work?
I was just smiling because Shelle started with skills. And skills are that's the currency that you really need as our workforce or economies evolve around work. And also as people continue to move throughout their careers or throughout organizations and apply those particular skills. So, but for us, from what we do is a lot of it's all about providing access and enabling and facilitating people's ability to acquire those skills, develop those skills. And so we've been working very hard in making sure that people have access to high quality learning, have access to other people in our organization or others outside of the organization to really refine their skills and their knowledge. But access is absolutely critical, a critical part of the process.
Sure.
Yep. And could I actually just build on Steve's point? I think in terms of access also, I think there's this element, and Steve, I'd love your thoughts on this, of, when do I actually need that skill, and being flexible and dynamic around, I need that skill now versus I'm going to need that skill, 2 jobs from now. Yep. So why don't I sort of upskill for the moment? And then as I'm progressing through my career, you recognize like, hey, I need this new skill. I need to know like big data, right? Like that's like the hot thing right now. And so then you sort of bolt on that skill on a more dynamic as needed basis, as opposed to the old model, which is you build all this foundational skill and you just sort of have it stored in a reservoir just in case, right? It was just in case education as opposed to just in time education.
Yeah, and it's kind of tricky because we call that, the way we've captured it is there's sort of those micro moments, day to day, I need something to learn, I need to do something now. And then there's those macro type of experiences that I need to gain or activities from which I need to learn or people I need to access for more the longer term types of things. And we need to be in a position where we have a culture and an infrastructure to facilitate that. And that's not always so easy, because there is sort of this legacy way of thinking around this, like you just described. So that's a big part of it, is to be able to have those things, the infrastructure in place, but also think about it's the sort of just-in-time micro type of things, but also ensuring that people can look forward and determine what they need for the future.
You know, we got so much technology, right, available today, and it feels like sometimes it's we're catching up to technology all the time when it comes to workforce, or education does, I think, a good job at adopting a lot of technology that cross over into the workforce is sometimes a challenge. Chisa, what are you saying on because you're really on the front line when it comes to young people that are looking to access education, and building on what Steve said about access? Anything that you've learned?
For sure. We've learned the power of HR in all of this. Unfortunately, no matter how we look at it, HR has kind of been that gateway of white supremacy, to quote my friend Aisha Joseph, when it comes to upholding it in the workplace. And that means that any organization is going to be built off of the individuals that make it up. And whenever we have biases or gatekeepers at the forefront, we are not just stifling the growth of that company, but we're stifling the growth of innovation. And biases and discrimination, and especially when it comes to access, are very expensive to us as a society. We don't get to create as cool or as innovative objects or technologies as we would like. And whenever we're discussing that with young people, Gen Z understands that very well. And that's why we see a shift when it comes to young people and where they want to work, or where or who they want to support. Gen Z cares about people that care. And when it comes to them as a unit, they are either going to break into these industries, or we're going to see them start to separate, collaborate amongst themselves, and create their own. Either way, we are going to see this powerful group of young people get the ending outcome that they're looking for.
I'd love to toss a question out to the group, and whoever wants to jump first. Especially in this time of COVID, it feels like when we talk about education, there's a lot of challenges. Are we going to get back to school? There's a perspective that colleges maybe weren't as prepared as they could have been for shifting to remote work. And at the same time, where do you think things, future of work elements have been accelerated right now? Because there's been this conversation around future of work trends have just been, accelerated maybe, a few years, a decade or more. Are there anybody's saying that have been accelerated that should, as a rallying cry to anybody watching, should tell us that, we should pay notice and get going?
I'll just sort of jump in here. The obvious thing might be the use of technology, virtual tools, Zoom like we're using now, all of those types of things. Maybe that's being accelerated, but these things have always sort of been there. And I think it's less about that. And what I'm observing is it's more about a cultural acceptance to a people as part of an organization to be able to operate and work and get work done in, wherever they are, and do it responsibly. And that's the acceleration I'm seeing. And I know it's different across industries and things of that nature, but based on a lot of people I talk to, and I see it even in our organization, all of a sudden where there was a little bit of a reluctance before, now with COVID, there seems to be this very quick accelerated acceptance or new adoption to new ways of working in a virtual way. The technology is just an enabler. It's more this sort of cultural acceptance I'm seeing.
Just to piggyback off of that, I feel like a beautiful thing we're also witnessing is the acceptance of seeing I guess the acceptance of people however they are. It's very commonplace now to see someone operating, working, maybe with their children playing in the back, or the puppy doing something crazy, or family members. And it's a much larger tolerance that while our situations might not all be the same, we are all able to still work together for that greater goal. And I think that's been a really beautiful acceleration in regards to the tolerance.
I also think I would just say the third thing that I've noticed, because I completely agree with what has already been said, but I would also add that I think people are now valuing what is the value of actually being together, and what can we actually do effectively in a distributed environment. And I think people are now starting to understand the difference between those two things. And if we tease apart the work that can still be done as well, if not better, in a distributed or remote environment, but what's the value of actually having people together? And I know that as an instructor, having my students in the room is something that is very hard to emulate, no matter how good the technology is, right? When you can feel, as an instructor, you can feel when your students are getting it and when they're not, right? Or when there's energy in the room, or Sam actually wants to build off of something that Chisa said, and just this direct dialogue begins to take place. That's a little bit clunkier in a distributed environment, and when you're trying to do that over technology. So I think there's still work to be done about how do we actually do both of these things to really have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it's a great point. The challenge of being able to, I've learned something with my team, just being disconnected just in physical location has made a direct impact on the way we coach. And, we've seen it in other businesses. It's even when you think about, training as a topic or communicate, it's almost become time just to communicate, not so much to train, but you miss a lot of in between time. We had Shelle, who was the city leader. I think Chisa might know Shelle from the city of Newark's New Jersey All-Star Project. They do a lot of work with young people, high school age, trying to make sure they get access to mentorships, apprenticeships, internships. And she made the comment that some people are going into, some kids right now, we're in 5th grade, for example, and they're going to come out of COVID, an 8th grader, just in to access to technology they might have had in their home, while others might go in a 5th grader and they might regress. They might not be able to move forward. I'm interested in that impact on future workers, Steve. Like, how do you think about it from Novartis' side, knowing that you have, potentially a wave of younger workers who are going to have this experience gap potentially? How does that play into how you think about talent?
Yeah, we tend to have a mature workforce, and but I think the main way we think about it is based on skills. So we think about it in terms of skills and what people really bring in, the experiences that they bring. So that's, it's funny because I'm not sure, frankly, if we thought about like what this impact is going to be and what this might mean in the future. But I can tell you that we are very interested in people. We're interested from a skills perspective where they're coming from. We're also interested in the type of experiences they've had in that whether or not they're really lifelong learners. And that's an important factor. I think it will have an impact. I think it might delay people's progression in their education and in their in their lives. I'm interested to hear other perspectives on it. Just in terms of that, I don't know. It's a great question.
I think that when I hear that question, the first thing that came to my mind was that these companies and these corporations are going to have to strengthen their pipelines into communities. It sounds like if we're going to be in a situation where these students skill-wise are going to be all over the place, the best thing we can do is make sure that the private sector is consistently letting these students know what they need to know. And that way, at least the students and the organizations they're part of have the opportunities to specify skill sets. And maybe this is one of the brighter silver linings of COVID, is that these organizations are going to have to not just wait until someone graduates from their higher education institution. It's even important for them to be part of that middle school process. And it's an advantage. You know, when you have Prudential working with the middle schoolers of a city, it's an advantage to Prudential because they get to develop them at a young time. Obviously, there's the brand awareness, but they utmostly get to craft the lifelong development of their future workers. And so, unfortunately, I guess on the other side, you start seeing a divide between the companies that have the capability to do that and those that don't. And we'll see how that develops over time.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting developments that I've seen is sort of the rise of ed tech and just some very creative applications in terms of companies. This goes, it's building on both what Steve and Chisa said, companies understanding that here's like the core skill that I'm really trying to look for and develop in my employees. And so I've seen some apps where they will just distribute a question out to a bunch of like 10th graders, right? And as you begin answering these questions, it's almost like a game, right? They begin to build a relationship with you. They begin to see what kind of skills you have. They can then start to develop those skills in you a priori, right? And then all of a sudden, to Chisa's point, you've started to build this pipeline that isn't locked into the traditional, I call it batching process, where you go to a university, you batch a bunch of candidates together, you do your 3 days of interviewing and blah, 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 right? Like, again, you can get very creative about going over the top or around some of the existing infrastructure to try and tap into and or build the skills that you want to see in your future workforce.
And even actually just building off of that, because that's a great point. Something that's going to take place throughout all of this is we have to strip ourselves of, we have to unlearn a lot of things. A lot of times corporations will put more weight on a candidate that might have come from Brown as opposed to Ohio State. Not that I like Ohio State. I avidly feel like I don't, but they might put more weight on a candidate that comes from Brown as opposed to Ohio State. But what we've seen, especially during this time period, when you're looking at the data and even the most recent affirmative action lawsuit that came with Harvard, not to push at your organization, your institution there, but we see that these Ivy League institutions overwhelmingly have students that are from a 1 percentile of the world, and it's a huge amount. Like I said before, discrimination is expensive for all of us because that's a huge amount of diversity in thought, in background, obviously demographic, that are not included in these organizations that are assuming that the best of the best are coming out of these top institutions. And it's not that these students from the top institutions aren't prepared. I'm not commenting on that, but it's that you aren't choosing the students that actually can be best for your organizations, or you're not choosing the workforce that is going to truly move you to that next level. And we're going to see a lot of shift in that. And we have to, in order to really move us forward as an industry, as a country, and as a society.
It seems like the majority of, on the panel we had with government, it seems like the majority of the way the government tries to impact the topic of education is through federal funding, or funding technical schools or vocational schools or community colleges. I think it's fair to say Georgetown had a research study. Their Center of Education and Workforce came out and said a person who has a college degree makes $1 million more in their lifetime than one that doesn't. So I don't think there's an argument that there's value in a college education. But I wanted to ask, to the group, whoever wants to take this one, there's always been this perspective that, school has a certain role in preparing someone for the world of work, and then companies do. How is that balance? There's always an argument over, how much and where the weakness or where the gaps are on both sides. How is that, or let me word this different. What needs to change as we move forward into the future when it comes to the balance between education's responsibility in labor and the role of a HR talent and learning apparatus inside of a company?
So I'll take a shot at it, because I do think it varies dramatically by industry. But if I take, financial services, which is a sector that I used to work in, and I still do research on financial services and sort of psychology of money and how consumers think about money. I think that schools can do a much better job in terms of teaching some very basic things, right? So my sister and I joke around how we used to have this class in high school called life skills. And we joked about it when we were in high school. And then we realized that's where I actually, in that class in high school, I learned how to write a check. Like, how do you actually fill out a check? How to balance a checkbook. I learned how to calculate interest on a credit card, right? Like, these are the things that I learned when I was in 11th grade in school. And I actually have students now in graduate school who don't know those things, right? And so you can say you don't need to know how to balance a checkbook anymore. You have a bank account that's online. But if you don't understand actually how finances work, right? So I wrote a case and I teach a case on one of the credit cards that's out in the industry. And we spent an entire 20 minutes of class. I just explained to students, here's how credit card companies make money. So you need to understand this as a consumer. You need to understand this, if you go and work for one of these big banks or one of these big credit card companies, you have to understand what the business model is. And I think there's still some work to be done in terms of bridging the gap between what students actually learn around business models and sort of how things work. And then, businesses actually uptraining their own employees on the specifics of their organization. But right now, we've got some people coming into the workforce who don't understand the dynamics, for example, of compound interest and, what happens when you only pay the minimum balance on your credit card. That's not good for the consumer, right? So, I used to work for one of the big credit card issuers, and I was surprised, honestly, about how many people actually work at that company and just fundamentally didn't understand how we made money, what our business model was.
Well,
Sure.
and I'm sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No.
There's a gap, and this is a great example that you just shared between what you might learn at one stage of your education and then what you might need to learn to be a productive a person in an organization. And I think there's many studies that are out there that have revealed what those gaps are. One of those things, the themes that I've always seen throughout the years is leadership skills, what we sometimes coin as people skills, but these things to help, communicate, build teams, develop, all those types of things. And there's gaps. There's gaps in terms of when you learn things at certain points in your life and what you need to learn to do work. I think in terms of what needs to change in the future, because those gaps always exist, is strengthening these partnerships between organizations, companies, governments, corporations, people who are utilizing human capital to do things, and educational institutions, from maybe even an earlier age. So that there's, not that you're building a pipeline, but just so there's better alignment with the things that people learn at an early stage of their education.
And one more thing that I'd like to add is that I think, and I say this as a professor, we've gotten to the point in higher education, I think, in a lot of ways where I call it the applicant resume arms race, where a student has to have all this community service and be a varsity sport player and play the trumpet and get straight A's, et cetera, et cetera. And it sort of crowds out a lot of other valuable things like actually having a job. Like I had a job from the time I was 16 years old through my first year in college. I actually worked my first year in college as an undergrad. And I think one of the things that's very, very different now is that you have a lot of students that are coming out of undergrads who actually have never worked before, have never had a job with a paycheck and right. And so some of what Steve is talking about in terms of just sort of general skills, there's leadership skills, and there's also, in my opinion, followership skills. And if you've never had a job, learning followership skills in your early to mid 20s can be really tough. And so I'm like a huge fan of the summer job, and I think we should bring the summer job back.
Sure.
And my kids know, it's like, listen, I worked at Wendy's all the way through high school. It was not glamorous, but I learned how to manage my time because I had to be somewhere for a shift. I learned how to count change. I learned how to deal with irate customers. I learned that, right? And there's a lot of value in skill development and experience development in some of these jobs. And, I think we're getting to a point where a lot of that gets crowded out because of everything else that we like to see on resumes from students. And I think working is becoming undervalued. And I think we should really rethink that.
I think that also something that we're witnessing is an over-reliance on certain technologies, which actually diminishes the soft skills that we want so emphasized. And what happens is a lot of the generation coming up, we say millennial and Gen Z, because there have been so many technologies like our cell phone or our calculators, et cetera, that have been so advanced. A lot of times I think school is continuously emphasizing these hard skills whenever we're assuming that our cell phone can do that. Why do I need to learn to? And what happens is it really does diminish the ability to be in an organization, unfortunately. And we're seeing that across the board. Your hard skills aren't as developed, and then your soft skills, because you're utilizing those technologies, aren't as developed as well. And it creates kind of like this perfect storm that the summer job, you're right, fixes, or just being able to emphasize. And that's kind of can be the biggest difference between a comprehensive undergraduate experience and, more of a boot camp or trade skill is this emphasis on soft skills, whether or not that's in your extracurricular organizations or just having to survive in your dorm room. We see those differences. And I think if we're going to be able to equal out these two experiences as the best of our ability, we need to further emphasize the soft skills that are necessary for an organization to actually work together.
I used to like the calculator that we used to have to, remember, it was like T5 million or whatever the number was on it. So it was like 180, it was some crazy amount back. But I get it. Steve, you mentioned in this, with your workforce at Novartis, more mature workers, the topic of reskilling, how work is shifting and changing. How are you all thinking about and preparing for that for your team specifically?
We culturally really try to push and promote and reinforce, and we're seeing this is a mindset of being really curious. Actually, I've got my Be Curious shirt on today because I was actually doing some workshops right before this call. And it's sort of a mantra that we're reinforcing, and we're really trying to create a culture of we call them, of being learners, not knowers, and it's really starting to take hold. And again, then it goes back to providing access. So it's this idea of reinforcing with everyone that everyone to be curious and learn and question. And it's okay to fail and learn from failure. And at the same time, we need to provide them with opportunities and access. So that's how we get at our population. Again, it's across the board from in from our early career people to our later career people, but it's really critical to the work that we're doing.
It's great. Well, I appreciate everybody's time on this panel. I have one final question. We'll go around the horn on it. I'm asking this of every panel. We've gotten some really powerful responses. So no pressure for the question. So in Chisa, you got to go first since you're LSU. So you just go first. But what is your hope for the future of work?
Honestly, my hope for the future of work is a future that is more obviously further accessible, more reliant on the skill sets of an individual, more readily able for learners to be prioritized as opposed to those that don't have the curiosity to learn and simply have been given a certain skill set before they even had the choice. And my biggest thing, and you've probably been able to see that throughout all of this, is innovation. I think that we are incredibly not reaching our potential of innovation. And that's because, across every industry, spans industries, access to it is not there. So that comes from venture capital, where the innovative ideas across individuals are not being funded, to organizations, leadership that actually makes decisions doesn't reflect the world that we live in. And so my dream for a future of work is a future of work that is further emphasized on the individual, further emphasized with private corporations building pipelines to be part of this development process, and higher education institutions that are ready to put their students in a real workforce and not just prepare them with the best curriculum.
Great. Thanks, Chisa. Shelle, how about you? What's your hope for the future of work?
I love Chisa's theme of innovation because it kind of dovetails with what I would love to see, which is just this relentless focus on solving problems. Like, there are so many problems that are unsolved in the country and in the world that are just very, very basic problems that could make millions of people's lives, exponentially better. And so to do that, you have to really be curious, to Steve's point, and you have to have this mindset of innovation, and you have to really want to solve the problem. And solving problems is hard work. So, I hope the future of work is that it's gritty. It's, I always talk about like the hustle factor, right? People are out there hustling every single day, trying to figure out how do we solve these really big problems. And if we get enough smart people thinking about how to solve a problem, we can unleash the potential of this country. So that's one of the things that I really hope is the future of work.
Totally. It's great. Steve, what do you think?
So for me, I think it's going to boil it down to two things. One is more and more inclusive. And the second one is engaging. So people really, the future of work is completely engaging, where people feel like they've contributed and they feel like in an inclusive way.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in this panel. This was great. Thank you for your time.
Great.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.